Hi, this is Howard Cooper, and before we jump into this podcast interview, I just wanted to share that I've been lucky enough over the last couple of years to have interviewed a bunch of other leading therapists and agents of change, really exploring their take on everything rapid change related. What you're about to see was recorded a little while ago, but it still holds tremendous value if you're someone that wants to learn about how to help people make quick behavioural shifts. So I hope you enjoy, and to make sure you don't miss any of the new releases, then take action and click that subscribe button, and then you'll be kept in the loop when any new episodes come out. Welcome to the Rapid Change Matters podcast. My name is Howard Cooper, and for over 14 years now, I've been fascinated with helping people to create personal change quickly. But I still come across many who believe that lasting personal change has to take a long time, consisting of reliving traumas or deep psychological analysis, or simply that flawed notion that understanding why you have a problem will somehow make it go away. I'm on a mission to get people who work therapeutically with others to shift their thinking and realise that these beliefs are not written in stone. Rapid change can happen. So, to help you open up to what's possible, I'm interviewing top therapists and agents of change who are out there getting real results with real people really quickly. Before we get to the interview, I just wanted to let you know that I've written a quick-to-read, downloadable PDF on 5 strategies to amplify your client's response, with some great tips on getting your therapeutic suggestions to really sizzle. You can download this for free from rapidchange.works, where you can also find all the information about this episode and episodes still to come. Now, over to the interview. Today I'm joined by Mark Tyrrell, not only an experienced therapist, but a gifted trainer and speaker on psychological techniques. Mark is a prolific creator of learning materials and training products that help literally thousands of therapists to improve their skills. In fact, a recent project of his, which could be referred to as Netflix for therapists, allows people to see Mark actually treating real clients so people can see real therapy in action. As the co-founder of both Uncommon Knowledge and HypnosisDownloads.com, I'm sure today will be absolutely fascinating, but obviously no pressure, Mark.
Thank you very much for the pressure, and it's great to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure. So look, jumping straight in really, wondering whether you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how really you got started.
Okay, well, I spend a lot of time writing now and also delivering online training, as well as seeing clients via Skype and also face-to-face. I run or help run a really busy hypnosis download site called HypnosisDownloads.com, which has about 1,000 different downloads. We also run Uncommon Help Me, which is a site with about 120 different articles on just sort of self-help me articles, but also informational articles, so people learning about depression or what panic is, what panic attacks are, how addictions work and so forth, because I think really it's power to the people. Psychological knowledge, I believe, and I've always thought this, needs to be in the hands of everyday people rather than a sort of elite expertism. And although in some ways I have set myself up as an expert, so it sounds paradoxical, part of my ethos, if you like, or my raison d'etre, has always been and will remain to be to really sort of promulgate psychological knowledge so that, we can raise psychological health in the population as a whole, which sounds grandiose, but, you can psychoanalyze me about that.
Another time, perhaps. Another time. And how did you get started in all this?
Back in the late 1980s, I was working in acute psychiatric wards. They used to call them, I don't know whether they still do, but they used to call them locked wards. So these were people who were deemed a danger to other people and or a danger to themselves. So I would be on level 1 suicide watch, and I would help sort of deal. I say deal with because the treatment or the therapy was kind of non-existent, really, with people who were severely psychotic, and or profoundly depressed, or extremely addicted, and I got, I sort of went into that in the first place, partly because I needed a job. I was an auxiliary nurse, psychiatric nurse. So I was basically doing, everything that an RMN would do, but without the pay.
Hmm.
You know, I really went into that because because I was fascinated by psychology, but also because I felt like somehow I could make a difference to these people. And really, I got kind of disillusioned with the whole process. It was all about sort of containment and giving drugs, and there was lots of revolving door patients who would come in and out and never seemed to make that much progress. And eventually, I left that partly because I had to get a better paid job because I had a young family at the time, and I sort of retrained as a psychotherapist and a hypnotherapist and started working. And very quickly found that, to my amazement, the very types of conditions, perhaps not so much psychosis, but extremely depressed people or extremely addicted people or extremely terrified people could be profoundly helped through words, through psychological means. And this was the antithesis of the philosophy of the psychiatric hospitals, in which everything was about if someone was more upset this week, then it was about brain chemicals and not context of their experience, if you like. And so I went from one extreme to the other and finding that we could actually help conditions that weren't meant to be helpable that easily or that quickly, if you like. I wouldn't say easily because it's not always easy.
Mm.
That just a profound shift in my perspective, really. And very early on, quite early on, so I was seeing clients for about a year or so, and and also helping things that weren't supposed to be helped through psychological means, like sort of physical pain or blood pressure, things like that. So early on, I did a talk. I sort of got a slot, if you like, at the local health centre, which is no longer there in Brighton, and it was very alternative, and sort of wind chimes everywhere and that kind of stuff. And I the guy that ran that said to me, "There's an open day,
Hmm.
and all the practitioners are going to give a speech about their specific area of practice. Can you give a speech?" And I said yes, of course. And I was instantly terrified and needed to see a hypnotherapist because I'd never done any public speaking before, and I was there for the whole day watching the other practitioners. And when it came to do my turn, it was huge. So many people had turned up for my speech, and part of me was, felt sickened by that. But some part of me thought, oh, this is, there's obviously a hunger for this kind of stuff, psychological element.
Mm.
And I gave my speech, and it was probably quite awful. But I did a hypnotic demonstration from a volunteer because it sort of took the focus off me, and she was extremely hypnotic, thankfully. And so I gave that speech, and then I started running workshops. I thought, well, there's obviously a demand for this. So I started running workshops, and eventually, after a few years of doing that up and down the country, we started running our diploma course in brief solution-focused psychotherapy and hypnotherapy at the Brighton University,
Mm.
and we ran that for 10 years. But we also started doing stuff online in 1999. Me and my business partner Roger Elliott, and the rest is history, really, as I say.
It's amazing, and I wanted to go back actually and pick you up on something you mentioned, which was certainly looking at the psychiatric stuff that was going on. It was all about looking at it from a brain chemical point of view.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a place that has within the therapeutic intervention work in helping someone who is perhaps suffering with what they might call clinical depression?
I think it's very, very difficult if you're a doctor, GP, general practitioner in an inner city practice, and people are knocking on your door, knocking the door down because they're depressed, and there's so many depressed people. And I don't sort of blame anybody for prescribing antidepressants. And I think certainly if there's a crisis, then using medication to calm somebody down enough to actually help them in other ways is extremely valuable. I think the problem has been that medication has been, as we know, highly marketed. And of course, the best marketing model, talk about Netflix for therapists, is to have a recurring income.
Hmm.
And that's if someone's on antidepressants for life. So when Prozac became a bestseller, then you had people sort of saying, well, everyone should be on it. It's a lifestyle drug. You should give kids, from the womb, they should be on this stuff to avoid depression and that kind of thing. So I kind of got interested in that. I thought, well, this chemical imbalance idea. Everything used to be Freudian. It used to all be your childhood, and there was a sort of big assumption that understanding why something happened will somehow, getting a theory as to why, when you were 6 months old, your grandmother looked at you disapprovingly. That's why you have panic attacks in your 60s.
Mm.
It's that kind of thing. Take everything back, and that's kind of, an extreme example, but that's kind of moved on, thankfully. But now there is, especially in America and the UK, and other parts of the industrialized world, there's the idea that long-term treatment with medication is the only way, and you have a condition, and context is missed. That's the issue I have.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody could, they could have lost someone that's very dear to them. They might have lost their job. They've lost a husband or a wife or a partner, and they've died, or they've split up, or whatever it is. And that's the context which can be ignored, and we're just looking at dosage. Now, interestingly enough, with antidepressants, dosage doesn't make any difference. So a high dosage of antidepressant isn't any more or less effective than a low dosage. But a lot of what happens, of course, is we'll change the dosage. But but a lot of people don't know that. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a piece of information that people don't know. Some GPs, some doctors don't know that. Certainly, many psychotherapists didn't know that. So we have to question some of the ideas that the serotonin idea is built on,
Yeah.
and we have to look at the facts and really, we started Uncommon Knowledge, and we call it sensible psychology, because we do, for psychological knowledge to help the world, it needs to be grounded in common sense, but also actual research. And sometimes we might have to separate that from marketing, which is,
Yeah.
we live in the age of marketing, of course, and not just personal business, but certainly big pharma, if you like, pharmacology. So I'm not anti-drugs. If I have a really bad infection or I need antibiotics, and certainly I'm not, or if I develop cancer, then I'm going to use chemotherapy. I'm not anti-drugs, but what I am anti, if you like, is simplistic or reductionist ideas that don't take the whole of the human being into account.
Because some of the thoughts that I've come across before around that area are things like, if you broke your leg and you go to hospital, they would want to work with you to help you heal the leg, rather than just going, well, here's a stick forever.
Yeah, that's right. And there's another one which was actually invented by GlaxoSmithKline, I think, was that if you had diabetes, type 1 diabetes, you would take insulin for it. That's another one. And I've actually heard people say that. So the marketing has actually taken effect. And that is perhaps slightly disingenuous an analogy. Really, you might say, well, someone's very tired because they haven't slept for 48 hours. And if you had diabetes type 1, you'd take insulin, wouldn't you? Rather than actually they need to sleep, which is a natural thing, And the sleep, if you like, or the need is multivarious. With if we think about where the idea of the serotonin myth came from, so there's a guy called Dr. George Ashcroft, I think, in the late 50s, and he thought he'd found lowered levels of serotonin in the brains of suicide victims, and, specifically in the spinal fluid of depressed patients who then committed suicide. Now, sort of later experiments with better equipment didn't find lower levels of serotonin in depressed people, but and Ashcroft himself, George Ashcroft, dropped the idea. He said, okay, fair enough. Okay, that was just an idea. It seemed to be the case, but it isn't the case. But the psychiatric industry really sort of jumped on this, if you like, because it seems to be a simple explanation. If something's low, then you just top it up, a bit like oil in a car, And there hasn't actually been a link between conclusively found between serotonin levels in the brain and depression. There's I can't remember the name of the antidepressant that's prescribed in France that actually lowers serotonin, in the brain, and it's no less or more effective than antidepressants or placebo and so forth, and and certainly antidepressants can work for some people, but not significantly more than a placebo effect, so, of course, if you think about that, the placebo effect isn't nothing. It's a strong thing. It's a powerful thing. And there's, if you think about depression, it's all about expectations and negative expectations. So placebo is an antidepressant if the person invests belief in it, So it's kind of working on a person's brain chemistry in a way, because beliefs, affect brain chemistry. What we feel, what we do affects brain chemistry. Depression affects brain chemistry. And the idea that the cart has been put before the horse in some respects, perhaps, in that the idea is that, brain chemistry is causing the depression, which it may do in a small amount of depressed people, but there's no evidence that most depressions are caused by being born with the wrong level of brain chemicals, So, and I'm not saying, that no one should ever be given drugs or but it is quite frightening, the level of prescription, I think.
Yeah. So I know we've mentioned briefly when we've spoken in the past that depression being an REM disorder. And we're wondering whether you could elaborate on that. That seemed really fascinating.
Okay. Well, it's not my idea. It's Joe Griffin, who runs Human Givens. But it seems to be, and well, it's certainly a fact that when people are depressed, they dream more than when they're not depressed. They have more rapid eye movement. It starts earlier in the night, and it carries on. So rather than 25% of their sleep time being REM sleep, which for most of us is the case when we're not depressed, it might be up to 70% of their sleep time, which is a lot. And the thing about REM sleep is that it is called paradoxical sleep, because your blood pressure is the same, it's quite similar to what it is when you're awake. Your brain rhythms are similar, to when you're awake. So to all intents and purposes, it's a bit like being awake. So if you're over REMing, it's going to exhaust you. And it seems to be what happens, without getting too scientific, what happens when we enter the REM state is something called the orientation response gets fired in the brain. And sometimes you're aware of this when you're sort of nodding off, and suddenly you flicker, you kind of have a spasm. And if you're on the train, it's slightly embarrassing. Your coffee goes everywhere. You just slap the guy next to you in the face. But most of us have had that experience, and usually you're not conscious of that, and that's the beginning of the sort of REM firing. And it also happens. Pons genicular occipital spike in the brain sort of gets fired. To be scientific about it, during REM, but also when we have a shock. Okay, so you have a shock experience, and you're in a car crash or something, and everything goes dreamlike. People even describe it as being dreamlike and in slow motion and so forth. So it's like they've been tipped into through the orientation response firing, similar to the REM state at night, into the sort of dreamlike trance state, if you like, where everything feels a bit weird, and then it's all very shocking. And stage hypnotists seem to do this as well. They'll do something very unexpected, and sort of quickly mobilize the REM response, because we can equate rapid eye movement with the hypnotic state. The old ways of sort of following the swinging watch with your eyes is directly getting rapid eye movement going, in a very artificial way, and it seems to induce the REM state, which can be accessed outside of sleep. So that's anyway. Okay, we've gone off on a tangent there. So yes, depressed people dream more when they're depressed. They have more REM sleep. They have not enough slow wave recuperative stage 4 sleep. And so the lack of stage 4 sleep and the overabundance of REM sleep has people who are depressed waking up feeling very tired and unmotivated. It's like they've been, and it seems to be that what causes the over-REMing is the overabundance of rumination. Okay, so there's two facts we know about depression. Depressed people tend to over ruminate negatively.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and but don't solve the stuff they're worrying about. So the time when they go to bed at night, it's still the arousal, the expectation, the negative expectation is still in the nervous system, so to speak, and the dreaming tries to sort of flush out the expectation metaphorically, whether they remember their dreams or not. Okay, and for the next day sort of thing. But if the person's over ruminating, they'll over dream, and it's like a flat battery, and they wake up. And indeed, depressed people often say the mornings are the worst, and they feel totally unmotivated even to get out of bed and so forth. Now, a quick way seems to be to lift the symptoms of depression, not a treatment for depression at all, but to lift the symptoms is to wake someone up every time they're going into the REM state, and this has actually been done in studies, or just not sleep, which isn't a great idea. But sometimes if you have a night when you don't sleep, in the morning, weirdly, you can feel kind of a bit manic and energized, and you'd expect to feel the opposite. And it maybe, if you were over REMing slightly, then you sort of corrected that over REMing thing. Now, antidepressants lower REM states. Okay. So so they might be working in a way which perhaps the marketing agents don't know. That they're assuming it's the old serotonin idea, which is kind of falling out of favor a bit, but it could be because SSRIs, particularly, I think, do inhibit the REM response. But the problem being, if someone is REMing because they're feeling very angry or very bitter or very frightened during the day, and so they're generating those emotional expectations in the limbic system, but they're not dreaming those out metaphorically. Okay, then what tends to happen is that the person will start to feel angry and frightened, and they'll start expressing that more. And we know that SSRIs or Seroxat specifically is a suicide risk, taking those antidepressants. And it may be that the person's now dreaming less, they're REMing less, but now they're REMing less, they've got more energy, but they're still feeling negative, so they've got more energy to do bad stuff, if that makes sense. Yeah. So, in a way, if we look at the cycle of depression like that, we need to actually help somebody meet their needs in natural ways, so they naturally stop ruminating. So we go to the rumination part of the cycle, so that they can start meeting their primal basic human needs in ways which are healthy, and their sleep normalizes, and the whole thing. So antidepressants may work, but they may work in such a wonky way that it can be very risky.
I mean, I think it's fascinating, but also what kind of emerges is this idea of spotting a pattern and shortcutting the pattern. That's some part of it.
Yeah.
How similar is that as a process to facilitating change in other areas?
Well, early on, when I started doing this sort of psychotherapy, 1993, which does seem a long time ago. You were sometimes,
especially given you're only 21.
Well, exactly. Yeah, it's hard to believe. I mean, I must have only been about 12 when I started.
Yeah, absolutely.
I said it before you did. You'd hear lots of people say, "Oh, surely dealing with the symptom is superficial." And they talk about symptom substitution and so forth. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Then I was reading up about systemic theory, which says you change one part of the theory and everything else has to change to fit in, like a Rubik cube, which I could never do, by the way. But you change one bit, the whole cube structure changes, the whole pattern changes. And I started reading sort of stuff that Milton Erickson had written, and he said something about if you change, because he had to put up with more of this, people very psychoanalytical back in his day, saying this is terrible, just dealing with the symptoms, and he would say, well, if you move the handle of the pot, then the whole pot will lift and it'll change and it'll go somewhere else, and that's of course true in a sense if you think about it. When you deal with a symptom, you deal with the cause as well, quite often, if that makes sense. So some of the people who shout the loudest about treating symptoms as superficial are the ones that don't know how to treat the symptoms, I have to say. I don't like to say things like that, but sometimes things have to be said.
No, it's fine. It's not like we're recording this.
Yeah, that's right. And so, so of course they're going to shout loudly about that. On the occasion there may be symptom substitution. It could be that the person really isn't meeting their needs very effectively in life in a healthy way. So, for example, we all have we all have needs for attention and interaction with human beings. We will have, needs for being, purpose and goals and meaning in our life. Okay, we will have, so to feel that we've achieved something, and a need for community and making a contribution, which aids self-esteem. We have needs for challenge and creativity to avoid the stress of boredom. We will have needs for intimacy, and or feeling in control of life to some extent. And we have all these needs, and of course, if someone's living in such a way that many of these needs aren't met inherently by the way they are living for whatever reason, then curing their alcoholism but not helping them meet their needs in balance may have them taking up heroin. So I think that may be the origin of the idea of symptom. But the idea of doing deep therapy or somehow more profound or significant, therapy, I think comes from the idea of quite Freudian, of discovering why the person originally had to drink, and finding one superficial cause, for me to use the S word, one cause, and that is why they became an alcoholic or something. Whereas, of course, we can look at the context of the person's life at the moment and what need was the drinking meeting. Maybe it was meeting a need to, for feeling, if they feel out of control in their life, because they feel very passive, then that will cause anxiety, and the alcohol may seem to meet the need for the anxiety assuasion. It may make them feel less bored for a little while. So if their life isn't rich in many ways, so we need to look at the life of the person. Okay. But oftentimes, if someone just has a simple phobia, but the rest of their life is pretty in balance, then shifting the phobia, we don't have to, get them to pay for our mortgage for 20 years just because they have a simple phobia, and say, okay, but, we still haven't discovered the cause of this phobia. So we have to, talk about your childhood and this and so forth. I had a guy come and see me who had bashful bladder syndrome, and he had been to a hypnotherapist, I'm afraid to say, before he come to see me. And this hypnotherapist had been trained in the ideology that you have to discover causes and reasons, and then just knowing the cause will somehow miraculously get rid of the symptom. And that's non-superficial work in some way. And this therapist assumed that he had been sexually abused as a child, and he was a guy in his 40s when he came to see me. And he said, I know. He said, I didn't really believe it. He said, I know, because I know when it started, I felt, I was 17 doing my exams, and I was generally feeling very, very stressed. And I went into a public urinal, and I couldn't pee, because there were all these guys there, and I just couldn't pee. But I just felt so stressed generally, and it was like it just came out at that point. But this therapist has said, no. This has all the hallmarks of sexual abuse. And she started to suggest to him that his grandfather had sexually abused him. And he once he remembered this, in inverted commas, then his bashful bladder would disappear. And he started to get really upset because he'd loved his grandfather, and his grandfather was now dead, but he only had happy memories of this man. And then he started doing hypnosis, and of course people are very suggestible in hypnosis, and as we know, memory is a creative act, as well as, it's not just like a recording kind of thing. And he started to have images of his grandfather sort of looking at him in a strange way in a certain room in his grandfather's house. And it really upset him to the extent that he went back to his grandfather's house that he hadn't set foot in for 30 years. And he asked the new owners whether he could look around, and he found that the room had never existed. The room in his hypnotic imagination had never even existed in that house, which made him very relieved. And I'm amazed that he still had faith in hypnotherapy to come and see me. So I dealt with the symptom, and this other person was trying to deal with what they assumed was the cause. Now that's a difference, what people assume is the cause. Your question was, are there any other sort of instances of change being fast, I think, taking one bit of a pattern. I think so.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
finding a pattern,
Yeah.
and interrupting it rather than treating it as oh, if we get the cause, then it will uncover the whole thing.
Yeah.
Would you say that? I mean, we talk about people often come and say to me, "Well, look, I don't know how you're going to be able to help me quickly. How can you possibly do that? I've got a very deep issue."
Yeah.
Would you say that deep is an adequate descriptor of a problem, or is it just an unhelpful metaphor?
Well, it's interesting because it certainly is a metaphor, isn't it? Deep rooted, and the garden metaphor came from some German educational theorists who talked about child-centered psychology, and I can't remember the name of the main one. So forgive my memory, but they talked about children being needing to flower, and you just leave them alone, and they'll know how to flower naturally, and this sort of thing. And this got taken up by Carl Rogers, and he started applying it to psychotherapy, to counselling, and is minimal input from the therapist, and somehow just open support would be enough for the person to flower. And the problem is that we are metaphorical creatures, but some branches of psychology have assumed that the map is the territory, and that their metaphors are real. So you get people talking about the inner child as if it exists. It can't be transformed into an inner adult. Or sort of Freud was kind of half understood, I think, that we are metaphorical creatures. But he for some reason thought that it was all to do with Greek metaphor. You do get people coming along saying, "I think it's deep rooted," and often they say that without realizing that they're using a gardening metaphor. Okay, what they often really mean by that is it goes back a long way, and or it's been built up by lots of stuff that's happened to me over the years. Okay, which is fair enough, and we could. So what I'm quite keen to do, if someone does talk in metaphors, it can be useful to use metaphors with clients, but to actually unpackage those metaphors so that we can actually look at what's going on. So do you meet? So someone might say, I feel it's very deep rooted, especially if some other professional has told them that it's very deep rooted, and I'll have to pay you on a standing order. But who am I to argue? No, and then I'll say, well, what do we mean by deep rooted? And then they might say, well, what I mean is, it's, and then they might unpackage it themselves and say, okay, so it may have been over a long period of time that this happened, and we may get specific instances. So I worked with a woman who had been systematically raped by her uncle between the ages of 12 to 18. And there were hundreds and hundreds, this many times a week, she was dragged out of her bed by this man, and raped. And he was a car mechanic, and now whenever she smelled engine oil, she would have flashbacks. She was in her early 40s when she came to see me, and her father had murdered her mother before then, and her grandparents, she'd lived with them when the uncle was raping her, but they had been physically abusive to her and her brother. And she came along, and she didn't say to me it's deep rooted, but it wasn't simple. Loads of stuff had happened to her. But if I just assumed that we just had to explore all of that, okay, over and over again as it happened, just take her through the agony of her past again as it happened, then that might not have been great. It might have met her need for intimacy, or it may have met a need for purpose and goals, or receiving and giving attention, okay, and which may have made her feel better, which may have made her feel that the ideology of the therapy was working, rather than the fact that some of it was meeting her basic needs. But it wouldn't necessarily be for her. So we just took the worst memories and worked with those worst memories, and found that once we deconditioned the trauma from the very worst memories of these rapes using the rewind technique, which is as you all know, is a sort of effective way of lifting trauma and phobias comfortably and non-voyeuristically, then she found she started to sleep through the night again, because she was in this pattern of waking up every hour full of adrenaline, because the uncle used to wake her up at night. And eventually, so the ending, the denouement of that story is that she went to a wedding, a family wedding, and this uncle was going to be there. He'd never been convicted. She'd never taken him to court or anything. She didn't want to, and he was going to be there in his 80s, very old man now, and she hadn't seen him since she'd been 18 when she'd run away from home. And she was said to me, I don't have flashbacks anymore on nightmares, but somehow I feel like it's going to happen again, because her relationship to him had always been one of powerlessness, and I sort of reassured her, and we did some preparation work for that, and she found that she could go there, and she said he was just nothing to me, just nothing. He was like a small thing over in the corner.
Mm.
And I totally moved on, and she really moved on with her life. Now we had maybe 8 sessions or something like that. But I could have kept her in with all that. I could have kept her in therapy for 20 years,
Yeah.
So, and maybe not necessarily have made it a lot, So the danger is that a person says, it was very helpful. I understand why I have the problem, but I still got the problem,
Yeah.
and that's what we want to avoid.
And it's interesting as well, and I kind of want to reiterate something that often comes up on these podcasts, which is, given that this is all pitched around being rapid change, sometimes people come to the false conclusion that what I'm talking about is kind of these show-stopping one-hit wonders where they come in and you click your fingers, say the magic words, and 5 seconds later they're now totally different.
Yeah.
And that actually, 8 sessions is somehow long-winded therapy, and I don't think that's the case at all.
No.
It doesn't have to be, she came in and you flicked your fingers and she left,
No, I can't do that. I can't just click my fingers and someone's better. Unfortunately,
I'd love to be able to do it. What, you mean you can't do that?
I can't.
Oh,
I can't. But the other thing is, if you think about it, I mean, I worked with a guy who had been traumatized in World War II in the 1990s, and he said, well, this goes back a long way, and it did, and he had some horrible memories of being in the Navy, and I won't describe his memories to me, but to you, because trauma can be vicarious, but he we worked with him, and we took the charge out of that memory, and he was fine afterwards. It was one specific memory that really troubled him for 50 years. And you could say, well, that's superficial, but if you think about it, post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma is quite simple in the way that it works. And if it takes you 20 minutes to remove it, say one memory, perhaps, thoroughly and comfortably remove that traumatic memory, then that's still quite a long time in a way, because maybe the memory only took a minute for the person to learn that trauma from the actual experience. You see what I mean? So the brain learns quickly. That's what I'm trying to say. And there's, so it's still taking 10 times longer to remove it than it was for that. Maybe it was a minute's worth of traumatic experience that this man had 50 years before, and that 1 minute of experience taught him to be traumatized for 50 years. He went into the REM state. He was totally transfixed on what was horrible things that were happening in this particular experience, and that taught. So the brain learns quickly. Unfortunately, it learned something which made his life difficult for 50 years in some ways. So spending 20 minutes or 15 minutes dealing with that memory is comparatively a long time if we think about how the potential of brain learning and how fast it can happen, especially on the emotional level.
Yeah. Certainly, one could argue that it's top heavy in terms of time spent, but it's watch this space for the finger clicking course that we're going to
run. Yeah, well, you would make money. You would get people signing up for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there would be a placebo element to that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah,
people would feel that they had sort of benefited from that. And sometimes you get therapists who are quite competitive, quite macho, so, well, I can cure a phobia in 10 seconds. And, why are you taking 20 minutes to cure this and that? And it all gets quite sort of, macho, should we say.
Yeah.
But we could avoid that. We want to have a nice, gentle experience for the person overcoming a phobia or a trauma. It doesn't have to be wrenching the thing from them. But I mean, sometimes you are looking for a cause of something. And because you do want to deal with an initial experience. I was talking to a friend the other day who, in his 50s, is doing a film degree, and he's doing an essay, an essay on Carol Morley, the director who made a film in 2014 called The Falling, which is about a girls' school in 1969 and the sort of mass hysteria. As I haven't seen the film, but this is a sort of synopsis, and it's sort of mass hysteria and this sort of thing has happened in schools, and the fainting. All these girls are fainting, and it kind of reminded me of a client I had maybe 10 years ago now, 15-year-old girl, and she came along and she kept fainting at school. It's before the movie. Had neurology tests, all kinds of stuff, and she'd had 50 or 60 CBT sessions, and she said that didn't kind of made it worse in a way, and she had to analyze everything and all her thoughts, and somehow her thoughts were causing this rather than her emotional learning, and that hadn't really worked. So I was thinking, oh God, this is pressure, So, and I'm only telling you about the successful clients, by the way, of course. We had 2 sessions, and the first one she described. She was really articulate and nice 15-year-old, really sort of intelligent, articulate, empathetic, and sort of nice person. And they had thought that maybe she was putting this on for attention, and it would only happen at school, but it happened in quite profound ways. She couldn't go upstairs during break times at school, and all her friends that she really liked went upstairs at break time. So she wasn't sort of getting a secondary gain from this, and she was kept downstairs, and she hated it because they thought it was too dangerous to be up some stairs if she fainted when she was coming down them, so although she was marked out as special for having this, she wasn't clearly enjoying having this special status at school. She got on a French trip early on when she had this fainting, and she'd almost drowned. She'd fainted in a boat, I think, or when she was swimming in a lake or something like that. So it didn't seem to be something she was sort of putting on. I thought, this is very weird. So it doesn't seem to be neurological. So, it does seem to be psychological, and she's fainting, and I thought, well, human beings are metaphorical. Could this be, without sounding too Freudian about it, could this be a metaphorical reenactment of something that spooked her? And I sort of said, well, how long has it been going on for? And she said it'd be going on for a couple of years. Very disruptive in her life. She couldn't do sleepovers with friends or anything like that. All the friends were doing. And I said, did anything happen around that time? And her mother was in the session as well. Her mother said, well, you were really upset when so-and-so died next door. And it turned out that they'd had this neighbor who was very youthful. She was in her 70s, but she seemed very young, and she was like a grandmother. She was like a second mother to this girl. And this girl had gone to school one day and come back, and her father had told her, I've got some really bad news for you, but this woman has died, this neighbor, and much loved neighbor has died suddenly for whatever reason, and that was extremely traumatic. Now, no one had linked this to her fainting. And then another time, I said, was there any other time like that when you went to school? And she said, yeah, I came back from school, and her dad again told her that the family dog had been run over and died, And that's when, about a week after that happened, which was soon after the neighbor dying, she started fainting at school. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, that's really interesting, and I said, now, when you think about those times now, even though they're 2 years ago, if you just, recall them, does it feel horrible to recall them? And she clearly still had some, at least sub-threshold trauma associated with them. So once we deconditioned those 2 memories, fainting stopped. Okay. And so there's an example of rapid change. Okay, after 50 sessions of CBT, and I'm not saying I'm better than CBT, but it's if you're going in the wrong direction, then it's going to take a long time. So it seemed, so that was an example of actually finding the cause, okay, and treating the symptom as part of the same procedure. Rather, so you could say, well, that was superficial. You're just treating the symptom, which I was, but the symptom was the cause, and the cause was the symptom. And that was just an example that came to mind because of this film, The Falling. This girl's fainting at school.
So how would you explain to someone how you go about working out when you might look for the cause or when you might handle it in a different way?
That's a good question. I wouldn't necessarily think it's necessarily a sort of binary thing, either or. So I would want to always know when something started. When did this particular period of depression begin? And the reason I would ask that is not to find some one-off situation where, one-off little incident or something necessarily, because not everything's sort of concise trauma, if you like. So things are a build-up of stuff as well. So I would say, so you started getting depressed about 6 months ago. Was anything different then quite often, not always, but I'd say 9 times out of 10, this person will say, well, I started having problems with my relationship, or in some way, one of their basic emotional needs started to be impacted, it was difficult for them to meet it. So that is, and then so that need is important to this person. Okay, so how can we have them start to meet this need again, or stop worrying about not meeting it in future because they've had the experience of not meeting it? So that would be part of it, but it wouldn't be the whole therapy, if we're going beyond the sort of sort of neurochemical kind of, reductionist idea of depression.
Yeah.
We look at a person's life. Quite often it's a build-up of quite small things that aren't that dramatic, that just nag away and worry. It's like the Chinese water torture, one drip on the head doesn't really do anything, but 1,000 every day is going to drive you nuts, so maybe a child started being unhappy at school, maybe they were aroused with the husband, maybe they had started having health worries, okay, or they were worried about an elderly parent, or lots and lots and lots of things, and of course mulling over and worrying about the future, and that could be, the precipitation of a depression could be multiple rather than, and if that's the case, we kind of want to know that, because we want to know the sorts of stuff that the person worries about, and whether they seek to problem solve, or they just sit on it, or they feel powerless and helpless and just mull over without taking active steps to solve something, because we know that depressed people often have learned helplessness and feel very passive, especially if they're led to believe that they have a disease, a brain disease, and there's nothing they can really do about it other than take medication. So it makes them feel even more passive, perhaps. So the zeitgeist or the groupthink, if you like, is disempowering in some ways about depression, I would say. I will look at causes from that point of view, and also, of course, even if someone has a simple phobia of dogs or spiders or heights or whatever, of course, you want to know what memories are fueling this phobia, because people only have a phobia because they're connected to the past and past learning. So if someone tells me that they had this experience where they went for a walk in Sardinia up a cliff or something, and they suddenly were on this ledge and they froze and they couldn't look down, they couldn't go forward, they couldn't go back, and just telling you about it, they feel terrified, then that's an important thing about the past and about the causation, perhaps, of the phobia that we need to know about. We don't just click our fingers, because we do need to know how the emotional learning occurred, what we can do about it.
On a different note, tell me, if you wanted to get good at change work, are there any books that you can recommend people can go out and buy and read?
Okay, there's lots of books, and I don't claim to have read all the really fantastic books on change work. I think, I love all Erickson stuff, Milton Erickson stuff. My Voice Will Go With You. So it's a really good book to read. Very entertaining, very, very politically incorrect, as seen through the lens of 21st century ideas, or ideas we're supposed to have. But you have to obviously look at the time he was working, and also Uncommon Therapy, which is a fantastic book as well. What else? Put me on the spot. Phoenix. I really like the book Phoenix as well, which is about Erickson. The Human Givens book is really, really clear as well about research-based, commonsensical approaches to human emotional suffering.
If people wanted to learn more about what you do and how you help people, or even start exploring some of the trainings that you do and getting involved with you that way, how can they get involved? How can they do that?
Okay, probably the best thing to do is go to www.unk.com. So unk is unk.com /blog, and that's got everything on it, really. So it's got details of it's got lots of blogs on it, hence the name, and it's got sort of other information about courses. Go to our Uncommon Practitioners Facebook page as well. So that's Uncommon Practitioners Facebook page, or the Hypnosis Downloads Facebook page. But the practitioners one is as the name suggests, for practitioners. And also we've got the hypnosisdownloads.com site as well. And there are a few articles in there now as well, and other sort of bits of information. So those are the starting points.
Fantastic.
We've got our other sites as well, but like the books, I won't list them all.
And we will put the links. I will put the links up on both the iTunes information and also on the website. So people will be able to, if you're listening now, you will be able to click through very easily on these things. Is there anything that we haven't covered that actually, when you were thinking, we're going to talk about rapid change work, that actually would be useful to cover or to talk about or to think about?
It's a good question. I mean, one thing I would say is that there's every reason as a therapist or a practitioner or a coach or whatever sort of persuasion to be optimistic about people. And the reason for that is because it seems to be the case that for every year that someone lives beyond a certain point, that they do naturally get better. So and this holds good for, it comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, even for psychosis, for schizophrenics, as long as they stay alive, they will tend to get better, whether they have bipolar disorder or psychosis, psychotic illness, intermittent episodes of, psychosis or depression or it will naturally get better because people tend to learn coping mechanisms. So what we as a therapist can do is sort of click into this natural process of life teaching people how to feel better and be better. And, because people do get better, and you probably had the experience, and I certainly have, of sitting with a client the first time and you become almost as despondent as they are if you're not careful. But one thing we know about human beings is that they are here to learn and to thrive. Okay, so what we're doing isn't unnatural. It's not an unnatural drive towards health. We are working with nature, and as long as we do that sensibly and in wisely and creatively and flexibly, and work with the person, and don't try to sort of inflict too much of our ideology on them, but work with them in principled ways, then people do get better for all kinds of things. And that's something that I instinctively felt all those years ago in the psychiatric hospital. And that's what drove me to do what I'm doing now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mark, for taking the time to share some of these ideas with people who are listening. And really, really appreciate it. And again, thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure, Howard. And thank you for everything that you do as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, why not share it with anyone you think might be interested, and even head over to iTunes to give us a glowing review. You'll find more about what's coming up on our Facebook page, facebook.com/rapidchangeworks. And of course, you'll find all the links related to this episode, plus those free 5 steps to getting your suggestions to sizzle over at rapidchange.works.